Hi. Actually, yeah, if you could dim it a little, that'd be good. Can everybody see? Yeah, fine, okay. So, okay. So just briefly, my name is Dr. Babo. I'm full-time faculty here at the Department of Education and Leadership. I actually graduated in 2001 from Seton Hall, but I was in a traditional program. The exec program was just really kind of getting underway back in the dinosaur age back then. But anyway, we're going to talk about directed research and specifically what you need to do in the qualifying exam as far as directed research is concerned and your response in directed research. If you have questions, feel free to ask throughout. I hope to be able to cover everything and give you some basic understanding. If the PowerPoint that I'm showing to you you're interested in getting, I'll leave my card on the table and you can email me within the next week or so and I'll send you the PowerPoint that I have here. The two documents that I handed out are actually incorporated into the PowerPoint, and I thought they might be helpful resources to you. So anyway, when you get the qualifying exam, the research exam question, the qualifying exam question, that's basically, these are the directions. It says choose one of the general topic areas listed. This actually comes from one of the exams, and okay, just careful. This actually comes from one of the exams, so there are the directions. Choose one of the general topic areas listed below and develop a research study that addresses the topic. As you explain the study, be sure to include each of the following, and I'll click on that in a minute. But these are typical topics that you'll get for the K-12. The effect of preschool attendance on student learning in the third grade, principal support on teacher job satisfaction, inclusion on special education students' learning. They're broad, general topics, but I have to tell you, they're prompts is really what they are. With the change of a few words, you could actually take some of the topics. This isn't always the case, but let's say 75% of the time. Take the simple topic and with a couple of word changes, make it a research question. We kind of do that on purpose. For the most part, the research questions or the research topics, the prompts that are given to you can be answered. Usually there's, two of them are definitely quantitative in design, and one of them can be answered either qualitative or quantitative. My suggestion to you is answer the topic that you feel the most comfortable in whatever methodology. If you feel comfortable in quantitative, answer that. If you feel very comfortable in qualitative, answer that. I know Dr. Stetter does a qualitative research class as part of the Exec ED, I believe, correct? Or maybe you guys will get that. You've had intro to stats, or you've had stats 1, so you have some quantitative background. We're not looking for, expertise in statistics or whatever. So if you're interested, if you think your strength is in a quantitative design, then I would try to answer the question that you feel that you're going to be strongest with. Okay?
You said 2 were qualitative or quantitative?
No, usually 2 are set up in some form where they can be rearranged into a quantitative study. And 1 is usually qualitative, although with creative thinking I've seen some students take the qualitative prompt and make it into a quantitative design. And with some creative thinking I've seen some students take one of the quantitative prompts and create a qualitative design with it. I'm not saying that it can't be necessarily answered that way. It's just that, make sure your answer is fairly thorough if you're going to go over it. For example, in this case here, the effect of preschool attendance on student learning is definitely quantitative design. The other 2, principal support on teacher job satisfaction and inclusion on special education students, could actually be attacked from either a quantitative or a qualitative design, depending on what you're going to focus on. Okay, probably the one that fits the best to a qualitative is number 2 prompt, because it's really looking for teacher input. Although it could theoretically be addressed with a quantitative, like a survey. And when I'm saying these terms, quantitative and qualitative, I assume that you understand what we're talking about. In qualitative methodology, the primary data source or information source is narrative in nature, whether that narrative be through interviews, through focus groups, through observational notes, through field notes, through documents. That's predominantly qualitative. Okay. Quantitative is anything that deals with numbers, right? So, you know, a relational design that looks at correlation, a comparative design where you're comparing two groups to one another, or you're comparing the same group to itself at a later period in time using some form of a measurement tool, whether it be an assessment, whether it be a survey. That's a quantitative design. Quantitative can also be descriptive, where you're using a survey. Okay, a survey is predominantly a quantitative mechanism because you're using usually some kind of Likert scale or scale on it to, you know, measure somebody's perceptions or attitudes or whatever on it. That would be a descriptive quantitative design. So quantitative is anything that's using numbers. Qualitative is anything that's predominantly using narrative words. Okay. So in this case, number 2, this prompt here could probably fit into a qualitative design. Principal support on teacher job satisfaction. It also could fit into a quantitative design using a survey of some type. Okay? Inclusion on special education students' learning. There's a lot of different ways you could go with that. You could, you know, qualitatively, what you would probably do is interview special education students, special ed teachers, so that could be qualitative. But it could also be quantitative in a comparative design where I have kids in an inclusion classroom, kids not in an inclusion classroom. Do you see what I mean? So some of them fit one design better than the other. So, you know, try and go with that one because it'll be easier to write a methodology with it. You know, it's tough to fit a square peg into a round hole lots of times. But anyway, what I wanted to show you, the little link I have up here, this is the typical rubric that we use when we grade. Okay, when your response is graded. So as you can see, there are these elements that need to be part of your response. The first element would be considered a statement of the problem under investigation. And I'm going to get a little bit more in depth into this in a minute. I just want to go over the rubric. But a statement of the problem under investigation, the research question or questions that derive logically from that problem, then a coherent research plan and appropriate methods of data collection to answer that question or questions, a data analysis plan. Okay, so first of all, you need to understand the data does have to be analyzed. So how do I analyze it? Well, quantitatively, there's many different ways to analyze things. If we're talking about a relationship, you all had stats, so you'd be looking at a correlational relationship. You didn't deal with regression in stats, did you? Okay, so you'd be dealing with a correlation, right? If it's a comparative design, where you have a treatment group and a control group, you're using some form of a t-test, you know, an independent sample t-test when you have two independent groups, one getting a treatment, one not getting treatment. If it's the same group being tested twice, right, we pre-test, then we hit them with the treatment, then we post-test, that would be a matched paired sample t-test. Okay, so make sure that you speak about data analysis, all right? If it's a qualitative design where you're looking, your primary data source is narrative, whether it be interviews or whether it be focus groups or whether it be, my brain just froze, interviews, focus groups, then you're doing discourse analysis. You're looking at the narrative, you're trying to look for themes, trends, common vocabulary, to see if you can find categories to be able to analyze the data. Don't get real hung up on this one. Okay? And here's the reason why I said all of these components are important. All of them are important that you mention them. Okay, that you speak about each one of them. Most important is that they all connect. Okay, that there's a consistency. But when push comes to shove, when you're writing the response, take a look at the points. What's the biggest point, Karen?
The research.
The methods. The methods are 10 points out of a possible. The entire points for this is 20 points. Okay? 50% of that is on methods. That's a hint. We really think the methods are important. So you really one, identifying a problem. Okay? Developing a question to answer or explore part of that problem. And then collecting data and analyzing it to answer that question. That's really what it's all about. If you want to pare it down even more, I ask a question, what's the information I need to be able to answer that question? That's really what research is all about. Okay? You know, we can get into all of the different quantitative designs and qualitative designs, but the bottom line is this: here's my question. What's the best information I can find that's going to answer that question? Now, how do I go about getting that information? So when you are thinking this, I always recommend the students, pick the prompt that you want, think about the prompt a little bit, and write a little bit of an outline to think about the actual prompt before you get into writing, and then begin to write. But make sure you focus your time on the method. What's the data that I need? How am I going to collect it? Where am I going to collect it from? How much am I going to need? And once I get it, what am I going to do with it when I get it? Is that data appropriate data to be able to answer the research question that I asked? Do you understand what I mean? Don't make a mountain out of a molehill. Focus on those two elements. My research question, my method. Because that's what we look for when we're reading it. I specifically focus on those two elements. Here's the research question. Does the methodology connect to the research question, to answer that research question? Sometimes students get into writing all of these research questions, and many of them, hint at 3 or 4 different types of methodology instead of staying consistent. With one research question and then maybe 1 or 2 subsidiary research questions or sub-research questions. But when you do that, those subsidiary research questions have to connect back to the original research question. Okay? So.
Are there a minimum number of questions you're looking for?
No. Well, I'm just looking for a clear, coherent type of a design. Okay? In other words, our prompt, I gotta click back. But, the prompts that I gave you are general and broad. You're going to develop a research question from that prompt. And like I say, very often, the research question might be only by adding a couple more words to the prompt, and then you have a research question. Not all the time, but sometimes. And then I'm looking, whatever sub-questions you develop, do they connect back to that initial research question? They need to connect back. Don't just pull something out of thin air because you heard it from somebody. Oh, I'm going to look at, because SES is supposed to be, I'm going to create that. Does it relate back to the research question? Okay? And then, when you develop your methodology, make sure you're collecting data that's able to answer those questions that you develop. Okay? No sense to do a survey if you didn't ask anything in there that's looking for attitudes and perceptions. If you have a relational study, and you're looking for measurement, 2 measurements on one subject, what are those measurements going to be? What are we measuring? How are we going to, what's the relationship between one and the other? How are you going to measure it? Maybe you do use a survey to measure it. Where are you going to get that survey from? How do you know the survey is valid? If the survey was chosen, if the survey was already in the field and used already, then we know it's valid. If you're going to create your own survey for this project, you have to then know that when I create my own survey, it has to be based on the research in the field, right, the literature, and it has to be piloted, okay, so that I can get, a reliability on that survey. Do you understand kind of what I'm talking about? Everybody okay so far? All right? All right, let's kind of get into the more the nitty-gritty. Okay, so here's each one of the sections. A statement of the problem you intend to investigate. The problem should define the scope and the precise nature of the problem, as well as the usefulness of framing the problem in this form. I always tell students to think of the greater problem. So if you take a look at the handout that you have, and I'm pretty sure Dr. Tinkin made this. I don't know if he actually made this, I think he did. He actually has it step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in there to go, in other words, built right within the narrative that goes along with the top outline. But he shows you the greater problem. He talks about testing in general, right, and how testing isn't that accurate, and there's a lot of controversy over testing. And then as he goes through that paragraph, he starts to break down and look at the specific problem. So he started with a broader problem and eventually kind of funneled it down to a specific problem, okay, which is at the end of that narrative. So that's what you want to kind of think about. So if we did go back to our prompts, you know, the effect of preschool attendance on student learning in the 3rd grade, you know, the broader problem there being is that, you know, 3rd grade is kind of the make or break year as far as students are concerned in reading, right? I mean, it's kind of the driving force originally from NCLB. So the greater problem, you know, are we getting all of our students reader ready and school ready by the time they're in 3rd grade? Research has been out there that says, there's research out there on both sides that says preschool attendance does have an impact on students on students' performance as they move through elementary school. Kids who go to preschool have a better shot doing better by the time they're in 3rd grade than others. There's research to support that, there's research not to support that. So that's kind of the bigger overall problem as you start to focus in on this specific topic. And then you develop a research question. And actually with this one, it could simply be, what are the effects of preschool attendance on student learning in the 3rd grade? So we didn't have to do too much to this prompt to create a research question out of it. Now, it could be more specific. You know, what are the effects of preschool attendance, you know, private preschool attendance or charter preschool attendance on student learning? And we could, you know, on student reading readiness or reading comprehension, you know, in 3rd grade students in urban school districts in New Jersey. So you could make it a little bit more specific. The nice thing about making it a little bit more specific is it helps your methodology later on. Because now you're thinking of a specific group, you know, that you're going to do. Okay? If we had just left this, what are the effects of preschool attendance on student learning in 3rd grade as my research question, we would assume that my sample would have to be what? The entire country. Right? The entire country. Right? And preschool attendance could be private preschool, public preschool, right? I mean, we have preschools now in public school districts that are not Title I districts that are not required to have it. You see what I'm saying? So the more specific you're able to make this question, the better it's going to make it for you when you get to the methodology, because now you're thinking and focusing in on one specific area and one specific group, and it makes it more doable to create a methodology from it. Do you understand kind of where I'm going at? All right, so that's the statement of the problem. I want to talk a little bit about the problem. We don't expect you to have, you know, a ton of references in this. And if you have a couple, that's peachy. But that's not the most important thing. We want, in this section, what we're looking for is, does the student understand what the overall problem is, what the bigger problem is, and are they able to focus it down to get to the next part, which is their research question?
Now, should you just put, like, if you could say, right here is where I have a reference, do you just put reference, 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 if you're not sure the exact person who said something, or just you're just going to assume that you know I would have put references in that section? Like, do I need to let you know when I think a reference should go in?
No, you don't necessarily need to do that, no. If you have a reference, throw it in. Again, what we're trying to look at here is that you can articulate the greater problem and see the greater problem as it derives into the research question, okay? If you feel comfortable doing that, though, you can do that. You won't get graded down for it or anything. You know what I'm saying? If you feel more comfortable doing that, that's fine. Again, the key element is we want this to connect to this. So then you come up with your research question or questions. Okay? If it's a quantitative design, most quantitative designs usually are focused around one research question. Okay? If it's a qualitative design, there's usually one research question and a couple of sub-questions. Because remember, qualitative research is very different than quantitative research. Qualitative research is more inductive, it's more exploration. Okay? We're exploring what are the factors that lead parents in urban school districts to choose charter schools. You know, that's something that can't necessarily be addressed through a survey. That's something that needs to be addressed by going and talking to charter school parents. All right? So, your sub-questions underneath that might be, do two-parent households have different, you know, are there different factors that influence two-parent households as opposed to single-parent households? Does working schedules have an impact on people's choice? You see what I'm saying? I'm thinking of broader questions, okay, but they always go back to that first question about what are the factors that influence parents in urban districts to choose charter schools over the public schools. My subsidiary questions or sub-questions should be connected back to that. Okay? They're just a little bit more specific. All right? Don't go nuts there, because for every sub-question you write, we're going to be looking for what's the methodology to back it up. What's the methodology to collect that data? Okay? But if you decide to go the qualitative route, we would expect a research question and at least one or two sub-questions. Because, again, qualitative is more inductive, it's more exploratory type research. Quantitative, we're usually looking for one research question. Doesn't mean that you can't have two or a sub-question, but usually it's one primary research question. Quantitative, usually. And if you put in a hypothesis, we're even happier. Like this, if you're looking at relationships, you know, what is the relationship between student attendance or student misbehavior and on student attendance at the high school level in, you know, urban schools in New Jersey, something like that. You know, then what your hypothesis might be there is no significant relationship between student attendance. You know, you all familiar with hypothesis, dealing with null hypothesis and stuff like that? You should have had that in your stats class. So you throw a hypothesis. Sir, you had a question?
Yeah, we shouldn't use a mixed methodology on it?
No.
Not at all.
Well, you know, this is what I'm going to say. Why you want to complicate your life?
A personality.
Yeah, but and I'll tell you what happened. I've read other students who've done mixed method, tried to do a mixed method design, and what they wind up with is no design. Because it's so scattered, they can't connect it. A mixed methodological design, to be done the right way, is actually a fairly sophisticated design. Is it a sequential mixed method? Is it a concurrent mixed method? See, those would be the questions that I'd ask if you're doing a mixed method design. Is it a concurrent? Is it sequential? What's the type of mixed methodology that you're using? Because there's different methodologies. You know, I mean, if you add that, you know, your primary question is going to be answered with surveys, you know, using surveys as the primary data collection tool, and then you also add in, you know, interviews.
That's what
That's not necessarily mixed method. However, this is what I will look for. My question would be, well, why are you doing the interviews? How are you going to connect those interviews back to your primary data collection? Now, if you say something that, you know, using the information obtained from the surveys, try and focus in more on what those factors may be, a series of interviews, and who are you going to interview? Why are you going to interview them? How are you going to interview them? Always think, don't assume that I know it. You know, you got to assume the person on the other end reading it doesn't know anything. So if you say, well, I'm going to do interviews, well, how are you going to do them? You do them by phone? You're going to do them face-to-face? If you're going to do them face-to-face, where are you going to do them? You know, like, well, I'm going to interview parents. Well, where are you going to interview parents? Because it sounds silly, but where you interview them has an awful lot, can tell us an awful lot about the information you're going to get. If you interview parents in your classroom, you're not going to get the same kind of information if you call them up at home, in their comfortable environment. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, let's say, for example, the job satisfaction, right, based on the principle. So in other words, let's say you sent out the survey, and then in the end you wanted to interview the teacher. Should we add that in, or just stay away from that component?
I'm saying if you want to add it in, just make sure you include all of those elements that we would be looking for as far as an interview is concerned. Where are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? How are you going to select your sample? Are you going to ask for volunteers? But obviously, usually you have to ask for. How are you going to ask for those volunteers? It's going to be on. You see what I'm saying? Is it going to be on the? Is it going to be on a survey question? Try and actually think. If I were to go out and do this, What's the practical reality of me being able to do this?
So in terms of the exam, it wouldn't be worth to do in terms of, it wouldn't strengthen it, the paper enough compared to the amount of time.
No, I'm not going to say that. I mean, if somebody did their primary methodology is a survey and they decide they want to do interviews and they have a good connection back to not only the question but the original survey, yeah, that to me is going to impress me. If somebody just writes down, and I'm going to interview, my question is going to be why? What are you going to do in the interview that was different than the information that you can get from the survey? Do you understand? And show the difference. You know, why do we do interviews instead of surveys? Well, because interviews get it more in-depth, you know, knowledge and feelings, and you know, whereas surveys don't do that. They kind of, you know, but the plus to a survey is I can hit 100 people where I can't interview 100 people. Do you understand?
I do understand. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So we go from our research question into what I like to think is the most important aspect of your question and your response, and that's the methodology and the design. How am I going to answer the question? What's the data? And I think of data as information. What's the data that I'm going to need to answer that question? Is it only one source of data? Is it two sources of data? Identify the data that you're going to need to answer the question. Okay? My next question would be is, why that data? Why is that going to answer the question? What's the logic behind it? Okay, once we decided on the data, where am I going to get it from? Do I have to create it? And by that I mean, not something unethical, I mean, do I have to develop a design where a group of kids gets a treatment and another group of kids don't get a treatment? Or the same group gets a treatment and I pre-measure them and I post them. That's creating data. Okay? Or do I have to create a survey and send a survey out to collect data? That's creating data. Right? There's also designs where the data already exists. We go back to the inclusionary, right? Kids who are included as opposed to kids who are not included. That's already predetermined. We already have data that exists. Where is that data? What would you do with it? How would you collect it? What would you collect? How much of it would you collect? In other words, where is the sample going to come from? Who are the participants in this study? Where are they coming from? I have a little link here, and I'll do the qualitative one first.
Are you going to be critical of the sample size that we illustrate throughout our methodology section?
Am I going to be critical of it?
Well, it's not, how much of that's going to weigh into?
You have to have an understanding that I need, I mean, I'm not looking for power numbers, if that's what you're talking about. You have to have an understanding that if I'm doing some form of an experimental design, a quasi-experimental design, and really anything where I'm dealing with quantitative analysis, you know, I don't want my groups to be, you know, any smaller than 25 to 30. You know, so, you know, we're talking 2 classrooms or something. We have a classroom of 15, a classroom of 15, the numbers are small, right? 1 or 2 kids can throw off the mean on either one of them. So statistical analysis now, you're not meeting the assumptions of whatever the statistical analysis is. So yeah, I'm looking for, you know, but remember, most of these questions you're dealing with a school district or a school or something. So you know, randomly select, you know, 200 4th grade scores from, you know, from the 4th grade New Jersey ASK test or whatever it happens to be. You know, if it's a quantitative design, you want somewhat of a decent sample size. Okay, you know, if you're looking at a relationship, you know, you want to get 50 to 60 to 100 kids or more to look at a relationship between one thing and the next thing. If I'm doing a survey, right, I'm looking to survey, you know, a minimum of, you know 40 to 50 people. Again, you know, that's all contingent. Later on, as you take more research classes, you'll know that the sample size is all contingent upon who you want to infer the results to and the power of what you find, the effect size and the power. Sample size has a big, you know, makes a big difference. I'm not expecting students to, you know, give me sample sizes for, you know, because I'm doing all district factor groups, you know. I would expect, though, if you were doing something like this, like you develop your study as a state study, like specifically in New Jersey, there's, you know, all of the district factor groups, I would be looking for you to address that. I'm going to take a representative sample, some type of stratified sample across all the district factor groups so I have a good representation in district factor groups. You know, if that's what you wind up doing. Do you understand what I mean? That you're thinking about that. See, research is about truth. What we're trying to do with research is find truth, is find a true answer to a problem, a valid answer, so that when I have the answer, it's going to hold if I replicate it over and over again. So that's what I'm looking for your thinking in that process. Does that, that's a long answer for a short question.
You sort of answered it, because I was going to say, if you were to narrow the question to urban schools in New Jersey, you wouldn't know the specific number, but I would think that stating you're using all of the urban schools, in New Jersey, that would give an idea of the number of, that would be in the data size.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know it, in the testing situation, but in
No,
the
but if you just say all the urban schools, that's fine. But there's also a plethora of different types of urban schools. I mean, if we look at school sizes have a lot to do with it too. You have high schools in Newark and stuff that are down to 2,000 people, urban district. Elizabeth is an urban district that has a high school of 5,000 kids. Two different localities, do you understand? So taking a representative sample across, let's say if I was looking at all the high schools, making sure I get a representative sample from populations of high schools, because the school makes a difference. The size of the school and the school makes a difference. Having that knowledge, knowing that, showing me that you know that an urban high school in Camden isn't the same as an urban high school in Newark. Many people may think that, but it's not. Does it have a lot of the same characteristics? Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely not a high school in Millburn, right? It's different. But it's still different, and you need to show me that you know that there's a difference between the two, and that you would look at all the urban centers and take a representative sample from Camden, Newark, Trenton, Dublin. Do you understand what I'm
So
saying?
we have to show that we are thinking through
That's right.
everything when it comes to the data.
That's right. I couldn't have said it better. Here you go. That's exactly right. What we're looking for is your thought pattern, that you're really thinking through this design, that the information I'm getting is truly representative and valid information that's going to answer that question. And when I see that thought process in students, I know they get it. I know they were thinking about it, they get it. And that's the important thing that we want to see. So you have to, one of the elements of the qualifying exam that we're trying to answer here is, when you take a question like this, you take the stats question, whatever, is can these students do a dissertation, of quality? Because remember, when you get to the dissertation phase, 90% of it is independent. There's mentors, and we help, obviously, but you're doing the majority of this research on your own, okay? So one of the things we want to know from this is, can this person be an independent researcher? With guidance, of course. We're not just going to throw you out into the world. But do they get it? Do they have an understanding of what needs to be done as they develop a proposal and move into a dissertation design? Because for most of us, many of you, you've never really experienced this. Master's thesis, if you've done incredible master's thesis, then yes. But many haven't, because you're talking about original research. You're talking about research that nobody else has probably done or touched on. Can you do it? And that's what we want to find out from here. Does this person have enough skills to be able to start down this process on their own? And if not, then it's our responsibility to identify it, number one, and then to remediate it, number two, to try and help you through that process so that you can be successful, not to just let you flounder. Well, she didn't do that well in the qualifying exam, she's never going to get it. No, that's not how we think around here. I know you guys hate the whole qualifying exam thing, but it serves a purpose on many different levels, and one of the purposes is it identifies for us individuals who may need some extra support as they move into this phase, because we want to see everybody graduate. We're not like one of those typical institutions. I mean, typical doctoral institutions are looking at only 60% pass rate. Most of your doctoral institutions, that's what they're looking at. We don't think of that. We're thinking of 100%. It's not about us weeding out. We want to make sure that you were successful. And this is the first time that we get a chance to take a look and say, is this person going to be successful or not? And if not, what can we do to help them and remediate the skills that they're going to need to be able to move into the dissertation properly, so that they're going to be able to be successful in the dissertation phase. Right. So anyway, so a coherent research plan. So these are one of the two handouts handouts I gave you, this is just a PowerPoint, but it goes off the qualitative essential elements. I didn't get a chance to really edit this down a whole lot, but it has some good things on it. You don't necessarily need, as you develop your design, you don't necessarily need to hit every one of these, but you should try and, it should help you think about your design for the question. You know, is the specific strategy of inquiry identified? So if it's a qualitative design, is it specifically going to be some form of interview protocol that's going to be used? Now, interview protocol can be one-on-one, it can be telephone, it can be in person. Okay, interview protocol can also be, focus group is an element of interviews. Okay, focus groups are, you know, you all pretty much know what focus groups are. They're 5 or 6 people. Usually, they're individuals. If we're looking at teachers, we want to have usually a question that relates to teachers. We want to have teachers, obviously, on the focus group. And there's, you know, the focus group can be open-ended, it can be closed, or it can be much more structured. But focus groups are another form of interviews. Okay, so what's the inquiry that you're going to look at? Is it going to be a combination of interviews and documents? You know, document review. If I was looking at school culture, let's say maybe I might do interviews with, you know, if you, let's say you were doing, it was something that dealt with school culture, and you were going to use an interview protocol. Who would be the people that you'd want to interview to tell you something about that school culture, right? Students, teachers, administrators, parents, custodial and support help, those kinds of people, right? That might be one element of it. You might also want to look at documents, right? You might want to look at some of the documents that have gone, you know, documentation that comes back and forth from the parents to the school to the parents. Newspaper articles that, you know, were at certain events. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that's, and I'm kind of giving an example of what document review would be, you know, looking at documents that exist to get a sense. Okay, but what's the inquiry that you're looking for? What's the rationale for choosing this specific strategy? Why are you going to do interviews? Well, I want to get a, you know, I want to get a real in-depth look at what the school district is all about. So I want to be able to talk to kids across the grade levels. I want to talk to teachers across the school level, getting at their feelings and their perceptions and their understanding of what's happening in the school. Have some type of rationale as to why you chose it. Okay? Most important, does the strategy align to your original research question? Make the case for that. Okay?
Do you have an example of a discrepancy in number 3?
Does the strategy chosen align with the questions asked? Yeah, well, I have an extreme where somebody writes a qualitative design and then they choose a qualitative design that looks toward interviews, using interviews as a proper protocol, and they use surveys, you know, where it becomes very cursory. You know, when you're talking about factors, when you're talking about feelings, perceptions, you know, some of that can be done with a survey, but many times those kinds of questions usually are better answered through some form of an interview protocol. Okay. What's the setting? Where is this taking place? In other words, the participants, the setting. These are common things for a quantitative or a qualitative. Most often in the qualitative design, the sample is a purposeful sample and adequately describe it. So who is the sample? Why are you choosing the group? You know, and adequately describe it. I'm going to talk to some parents. Well, what parents? Parents of older kids, parents of younger kids, single parents, two-family parents. Be a little bit more specific. The more specificity you give, the better we get an understanding that you understand. You know, this is a complex issue, and I just can't talk to 1 or 2 parents. I need to talk to, you know, an array of parents. If it's a diverse school district, I need to make sure that I talk to not only, you know, the Caucasian parents, but African American, Latino, whatever might be the breakdown, right? I want to talk to an array of parents. Parents who are on the high end socioeconomically, parents who are on the lower end socioeconomically. Do you understand what I'm saying? It then tells me that you've given it some thought. I want a fairly large array or dispersed array of data from the parents that I'm going to get, so I get a different perspective. Okay? What are the specific forms of data collection? I talked about that as far as either an interview protocol is concerned. Observation observations. Qualitative research also uses observations, field notes, videotape. You know what typical observations are. School culture. You might do a school culture where you do observations, right? Matter of fact, you could probably do a whole thing on high school culture just by doing observations. Going into the cafeteria during the lunches. Going into the teacher's room at lunch. Going to the teacher's room before school. Going to the teacher's room after school. Going to PTA meetings, going to sporting events, and taking observational notes. We gain a lot of information from the culture of the school to a certain extent. Seeing how kids react, how parents react, how teachers react. The hallway. All of you are administrators, right? I used to learn the most about my school when I was a principal in the playground. Every lunch. I was on the playground and I was in the cafeteria every lunch. I learned a lot about what was going on in my school just from that. I kept little notes in the back of my head. You know, but think about, you know, those kinds of things. Again, that you've given it thought, that you're trying to get a wide picture of what's going on to answer that question. If you have some information, if you have some literature to cite, you know, do it. The one thing I always recommend students, you all use the Cresswell book. Did you use the Cresswell book? Gray, use the Gray book. That was your directed research book? Then use that book. If you've read the book, then you can reference back to it. Is it mandatory? No. However, it does help to support. If you decide on a specific design or interview protocol, you can reference Gray. Right back, you know, and reference it. Is it required? No, not necessarily. What methods are being taken to ensure credibility? In qualitative methodology, usually there's more than one form of data that's collected. What we do in qualitative is something called triangulation. Triangulation means I usually try to collect multiple forms of data. Interview protocol, documents, observational notes. That's 3 different types of data. Okay? This way I can check across the data to see that trends are kind of consistent across. Member checking is something that's done when I do interviews. If I do an interview protocol with people, obviously the transcript, you know, you take everything down verbatim. It's usually audio taped. The audio tape is transcribed. And then usually member checking means that that interview, that transcript goes back to the person you interviewed and they look at it. Because a lot can be lost in the translation and punctuations and commas, right? We all know that. Especially if you're an administrator. How often does somebody hear you say something and interprets it one way, goes home and explains it another way? And before long, you have a major problem going on. I used to tell that to my new teachers all the time. Be careful how you say something. The kid hears it one way, and then he goes home and repeats it a different way to mom, and that's all mom hears, and all of a sudden they're on the phone. Well, it's kind of the same thing. You know, you try to be objective if you're the interviewer and you're taking notes and taking it off. But when you write it up, it can change. So one way to validate what was said in the interview is member checking. The transcript is sent back to the interviewee. They read it and make sure that what they said you wrote down correctly in the meeting. Okay? Data and are the steps identified? Is the data organized in some systemic manner? Coding, and I don't get too nutty about this. Usually, discourse analysis, content analysis, discourse analysis, mostly all of it uses some form of a coding system, which is usually connected to the literature base in that area, that content area that you're looking at, and then you develop codes through the discourse analysis. I'm not worried for you to know anything about that, because that's, when you take a qualitative methodology course, you'll learn about coding. But you should be looking for, all right, so you got all of this data. What are you looking for? You got all of this verbal narrative. What are you looking for? Well, you're looking for common ideas, common trends, common thoughts. Do they start to cluster together in specific categories and you're identifying categories? So I need to know that you've thought about it. You know, well, you got all of this verbal data. What are we doing with it? Okay? So, and it's really kind of logical, almost common sense. I'm looking for common words, common themes, common thoughts coming through that I can then categorize. in tables or graphs, depending on what their categories are. What's the role of the researcher? Is the researcher embedded in? Is the researcher kind of a third party standing from the outside? Is there any connection between the research and the participant site? Probably not. But if there is, you need to just briefly talk about it. The other one, is quantitative. Okay? Population. What's the population I'm looking at? Okay, what's the population? Where do the participants come from? It's kind of what we were talking about before. Where's the population?